All right, good afternoon. Welcome to Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum's Lunchtime Learning Series. My name is Liz Brandt. I'm one of the educators here. And today we are going to be digging into a little historical cooking. We're going to do two fun, simple recipes that you can easily do at home with your family. You could recreate them in your kitchen. But the really fun thing to do as we're getting into warm weather is to go out back and have a little fire, campfire yourself, and cook them over a fire, because you can't beat that extra flavor you get from cooking over a fire, and it's just more fun. If you do want to cook on a fire, just please practice safe fire. Make sure you have a good fire ring, make sure you always have water nearby, make sure there's nothing overhead that's could possibly be a fire hazard. And if you are new to cooking over an open fire, I just have a few basic pointers. First of all, when you're cooking on a fire, you don't have a steady heat like you do on a stovetop. There's going to be hot spots and cold spots, so you want to be mindful of that. Your pans aren't going to maybe heat up as evenly. I do recommend cast iron if possible. If you have it, cast iron is the best to cook over a fire with. You can use other things, but cast iron is really the best. And you want to be cooking on coals, not flame. Notice, we've got a little flame going in here, but mostly this is just a good hot bed of coals to cook on rather than, shooting flames. That's a good way to burn your food if you're cooking on shooting flames. All right, so with those that little PSA covered, let's go ahead and let's dig into our recipe. So our first recipe we're making today is called Manything. Johnny cakes, journey cake, ash cakes, hoe cakes. It's basically a simple flatbread. This was a staple of the colonial period, both in Europe and England and here in the colonies. And there are literally hundreds of variations and hundreds of recipes. The one that we're making today is from Amelia Simmons' cookbook, American Cookery, published in 1796, and it is my favorite cookbook because it is the first cookbook published in America of truly American recipes. So her recipe, I'm going to read it off for you guys. It doesn't sound quite like modern recipes. She says to scald 1 pint of milk and put 3 pints of Indian meal and ½ pint of flour. Bake before the fire, or scald with milk 2/3 of the Indian meal, or wet 2/3 with boiling water. Add salt, molasses, and shortening. Work up with the cold water, pretty stiff, and bake as above. And that's it. That's all the instruction Amelia gives you. These historical cookbooks, they really expect you to have a base level of knowledge, that you know how to use ingredients, what to do with ingredients. But don't worry, I have it broken down to some easier steps to go through for us today. So we're going to start off actually over here on the fire with our milk that I've started to warm. And to this, I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of butter. Now, her recipe calls for molasses. Molasses isn't something we use very much. You can find it in stores, but I didn't really want to go and purchase an ingredient that I wasn't going to be using regularly. So I'm substituting for 1 tablespoon of brown sugar. My brown sugar's a little old, so it's a little stiff. And then just a pinch of salt is going to go in here too. And we're going to, the milk is already getting good and warm, so we just need to get this butter melted down into it. My butter was a little cold. I didn't get it out of the fridge early enough. So Amelia Simmons' cookbook, as I mentioned, is the first cookbook printed in America. Oh, excuse me, I got a little flame in my face. First cookbook published in America, and it's really cool because there are a lot of American innovations in cooking that you can read in it. It's just such a fascinating look into the time period, going and actually reading these historical recipes. So we're going to keep stirring this. We're going to let this, all right, we're going to let this No, actually I think it's hot enough. I don't want to let it sit. I'm going to lift it off. You don't want your milk to burn. It's very important. You need to keep steady stirring so that your milk doesn't burn. All right, and we're gonna pull this over, and I'm just gonna let this sit for a minute and let that butter keep melting into the hot milk while I start preparing our next step. So, in here I have 3 cups of cornmeal, and to this I am adding just a 1/4 cup of flour. Now this is how you know that this is truly an American recipe and not a European recipe, because of this cornmeal. The Europeans did not think very much of cornmeal. They thought that it was just beggar's food. Really, it was only fit for feeding animals. But here in America, cornmeal was an important staple food. Going, of course, all the way back to the American Indians, who were the first people to cultivate it. We're just going to mix this together. I'm going to set this to the side. When the colonists first came over, they really relied on the corn from the Native Americans in order to survive. They had not done a great job of providing for themselves, especially the colony at Jamestown. And without that corn from the Native Americans, Jamestown colony probably would have failed. And from that point on, corn remained a popular staple of the colonial diet. All right, we're going to go ahead and we're going to pour this mixture now into our cornmeal. And we're going to start mixing this up. Cornmeal became especially important to the American diet in the 1700s. So in the end of the 1700s, Europe had a big population boom, and that led to wheat becoming in really high demand. Everyone wanted wheat. So all the wheat that was being grown here in America was actually getting exported over to Britain and to Europe. They could make a lot more money by selling that wheat overseas than to anyone here in America. And so in America, wheat became very expensive, and it was really only the wealthy classes who could afford to eat a lot of wheat. So corn became a very important staple for the middle and especially the lower classes. So I'm going to start forming these just into little patties. Just like this. I'm going to grab my plate here. Now, Johnny cakes, hoe cakes are, of course, were a very key part of the diet of enslaved persons. Cornmeal was usually part of the ration that they would receive, their weekly rations of food. And so they really relied on simple cakes like this. They would put in whatever flavorings and spices they could maybe get. And it would really be a staple of their diet that they would have with all of their meals. All right, we've got a couple cakes right there, ready to fry up. Now, if you wanted, you could take this cornmeal and you could bake it in a loaf in the oven, but that wouldn't be very tasty. This cornbread recipe is different from our modern cornbreads in one key area. It doesn't have any leavening agent. It doesn't have anything in it that's going to make it rise. So if we would bake this in a loaf, it would be really dense. I've actually done it. It's not very good. It's not very tasty. It's much better fried up like this. So leavening agents, there's a couple ways that you can get leavening if you want something to rise. So if we're trying to make a bread rise, there were 2 main ways that you could do this in the colonial period. You could make a sourdough using a starter or a leaven left over, some old dough that had the yeast cultured in it, and mix that into your fresh batch of dough to bake off bread. That gives you sourdoughs. You could also mix up a dough and leave it and let it sit until wild yeast cultivates in it. Or you could get yeast from somewhere else. You could use barm. Barm is created during the brewing process. It's the foam that gets created as the alcohol ferments, as the liquid ferments. And in that barm, there's a lot of yeast. So brewers would actually sell that yeast. They would bottle it and sell that barm, that foam, to both home cooks and bakers. And that was the main way that people would get, one of the main ways people would get yeast back then. Because of course you couldn't go down to your grocery store and buy a packet of yeast like you do now. So these are frying up nicely. Just gonna add a little more butter to our pan. If at home, you know, you could fry these in whatever kind of oil that you want. I like butter, of course, but any kind of oil that you want. They would have used butter or maybe lard. We're going to be using this pan for our second recipe too, though, and we don't want to cook our second recipe in lard, so we're doing these in butter today. These just need maybe another minute to finish frying up. Let's see, we don't have a screen set up for me to see if there's any
comments?
Any comments? Any questions? All right. So these are really good, served with a little honey on top of them. So good. You just want to fry them up till they get a little golden in color. Yeah. All right. So that is our first recipe, a simple hoe cake. Again, that was from Amelia Simmons' book, American Cookery. Now, we're going to go a little fancier and a little sweeter for our second recipe. Set that to the side. Let me bring over my other ingredients. So, our next recipe is also a hugely popular recipe for the time period. And it was eaten by everyone, from people who couldn't afford very much, from in the wealthiest of houses. And this is pancakes. So these aren't anything like our modern fluffy American pancakes. They're quite different. Now, if you want to have a nice fancy recipe, you're going to be using things like milk and cream. You're going to be using spices to flavor your batter. You might use orange blossom water or rose water. Those are two very popular flavorings of the time period. But if you don't have as much money, you're going to be maybe just using water in your batter instead of milk. Maybe you're not going to have any spices in there at all. Our recipe today is kind of a middle ground. It uses milk, it uses some spices, but it's not anything that would have been very expensive. These are easily obtained spices for the time period. It is from Maria Rundell's A New System of Domestic Cookery, and it was published in 1806. So in my bowl here, I have 2 cups of flour, and to this I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of ginger, ground ginger, a half tablespoon of nutmeg, and a half teaspoon of nutmeg, a half teaspoon of salt, and a half teaspoon of ground ginger. You don't want to be putting tablespoons of those spices in there. All right. And we're just going to give these. Yes, I will be providing these converted recipes in order for you to be able to make these at home. So we're just going to give those a quick whisk together. Now, in my other bowl, I'm going to take 1 egg. You always want to crack your eggs on a flat surface, by the way. It helps prevent getting shells in there. And we're going to whisk this up a little bit. And then we're going to add in some of our milk just to help get it all incorporated together. So it takes About 2 cups of milk, 2 1/4 cups of milk. There we go. And we're going to pour this into our dry ingredients, along with the rest of the milk in this one. And then I have a little more milk here on the side if I need to thin it out a little more. I'm going to start mixing this together. I'm actually going to switch to my spoon first, and then we'll go back to our whisk. Now, in your modern pancake recipes, you really, you don't mix them together a lot, right? You just mix until incorporated. But this, we're really going to want to mix it really well so that it gets fully incorporated. And nice, we want a nice smooth batter. Let's see, these are birch twigs, I believe. Is that correct, Nate?
Those are random twigs I actually found on the side of the road from just a little shrub that grew that was fairly sturdy.
Yes. So twig whisks were the whisks of the period. This has been cleaned before we started cooking with it. Everything did get cleaned. All right, I'm going to switch back to my whisk now to try and get this good and thin. I'm going to add a little more milk in, so it's just a little thick. And let me tell you, a twig whisk makes a modern balloon whisk seem like a dream utensil. There you go. You can see the batter's getting nice and thin. Had a little twig break off in there, but that's all right. I'll fish them out. Happens sometimes.
That'll just be mine.
All right, that's looking pretty good. Now, if you don't fancy the spices that I use here today from Maria Rendell's recipe, that's fine. You could use whatever kind of spices you would like. Cinnamon would be good in here. You could add a little sugar into the batter, make it a sweeter batter. But we are sticking to Maria Rendell's recipe today. All right. Oh, our skillet is looking pretty hot. We'll see, it might have gotten a little too hot on me there. Yeah. All right. All right, bear with me for a minute. We need to move things around. Our skillet's just gotten a little hot. It's gonna burn our food right away. This is the fun that comes with cooking on an open fire. Yeah, hear that? Hear how it's cooking and you can see the sizzle? That's definitely a bit hot. We're gonna push some of our good coals out of the way.
Sorry.
Nate was doing a great job in keeping the fire stoked for me, but he just overstoked it a little bit. It's all right, sitting it in the sand will help it cool down. These gloves are hilariously large on me. This isn't even the right hand, but that's okay. All right. Let's test it again. Let's see how this is doing. A little hot, but we're going to move forward. First ones, they might come out a little burned, but that's all right. We'll make Nate eat them.
It's the classic first pancake.
All right, so you're gonna want to get your bowl, ladle about 1/4 cup at a time, and you're gonna want to get it nice and thin. So these are gonna make thin pancakes, not like our modern fluffy pancakes. These are much more like a crepe. And that is because these, like our cornbread, lack a leavening agent. Now this is the way that they still eat pancakes actually over in England. This is what they consider a pancake, not our modern fluffy, delightful pancakes. So our pancakes get that way from baking soda or baking powder. That is something that we call chemical leavening. So when they are mixed in, they have a chemical reaction that releases carbon dioxide, and that's what makes it nice and light and fluffy. At this time period, there's actually very little chemical leavening going on. There was some early experimentation with pearl ash. In fact, back to Amelia Simmons, her book has a recipe for a cookie using pearl ash as a leavening agent. Pearl ash is refined potash. But it's really not until the mid-19th century, around 1830, that we see pearl ash and then other leavening agents become really popular. We start to see them really commonly appear in recipes, being sold. So you're stuck with either using yeast or our fourth leavening agent, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Just get a quick glance here. You can see our pancake is cooking away. It's lifting up around the edges, and it started to change color. There's still a little bit of pale spots here, so I'm going to wait until those pale spots darken, and then I'll give it a flip. So the kind of fourth main method of leavening, and this was also available in the colonial time period, is what we call mechanical leavening. So that is when we incorporate air through whisking. There we go. So there we have a nice shot of our flipped pancake. It actually came out pretty good. Over. So with mechanical leavening, what you do is you incorporate air into your batter, usually by whisking eggs or by whisking egg whites. This is a method that's still used today in things like macarons or Genoese sponge cakes. My papers just go flying. All right, that came out pretty good. That was used mostly in colonial times in desserts. So if you have a cake or a cookie, something like that, that you want to be a bit fluffy, you're not going to want to use barm in that, because barm definitely carries the flavor of hops in it. And I don't think you want, I mean, you might want a cake that tastes like hops, but I don't think I would. Just getting it nice and thin. I'm actually going to go back and kick some coals back in there now that's cooled down a little bit. This is what you have to do with cooking over an open fire. You are constantly tweaking the temperature, tweaking the coals so that you have the temp that you need. There we go. You can already see it starting to cook around the edges. The edges are lifting up from the pan. You have to be patient and really let the one side cook all the way before you flip it, which is the hardest part, because at least for me it is. I'm a very impatient cook. All right. Cook away. So I'm going to take a last minute here as we finish this up to talk about our fantastic cook table. This wonderful, wonderful invention was made by our other educator here, Nate Salzman. A couple weeks ago, he did a video on Native American pottery. So I came to him and said I would love to have a raised surface to cook on. During the colonial period, of course, they would have these huge hearths, these huge fireplaces that they would cook in. And they were mostly just cooking down on the floor, which just kills your back. But there is a tradition through Northern Europe, Germany and the like, of having these raised hearths. And if you look at photos, you can actually find paintings of these raised hearths. So I showed that to Nate, and I was like, Nate, I want this. And this is his genius idea that he came up with. It's fabulous. It's an old wooden table. We put bricks down, covered it with sand to give us a good surface that's insulated. We have a fabulous cooking arm here, which pivots so that if we had something in a pot that we wanted to cook, it could be right there. We've got room here for a couple fires, a prep space. This is Education's new baby. We're very excited about this thing. All right, we're gonna go ahead and flip this. Now I have to admit, I did practice this yesterday evening at my house because it had been a while since I'd made pancakes like this before, so I just wanted to practice. And I got pretty good. I was doing the one-handed skillet flip, but I'm not going to try that with this big, heavy cast iron pot. That would end very poorly. Just cook until it gets brown. And while that side finishes, I'm gonna prep our toppings for today. So to top these, whatever is your fancy, basically. Lemon and sugar is a very popular topping. Very popular in the colonial times and still today in England. You could do cinnamon and sugar would be great. You could do Nutella, would be fantastic. But today, I have whipped cream and some marmalade. This is ginger and orange marmalade, which is my favorite. So we'll grab our other one here. Now, if you fancy doing whipped cream and jam as well, I cannot recommend enough, make your own whipped cream. You really cannot beat homemade whipped cream, and it's like the easiest thing to do. You just need heavy whipping cream, 2 to 3 tablespoons of sugar, depending on how sweet you want your whipped cream, just a dash of vanilla, and then, you know, don't try and use a twig whisk. I mean, you can if you want to, but you'll be there for about an hour. Use a stand mixer or hand mixer, and just in a couple of minutes, it's whipped up. The key to making whipped cream at home, the kind of master secret, is to chill both your dish, the bowl that you're whipping in, and to chill the whisks in the freezer for a little bit beforehand. Okay. Grab a little bit of my jam. And now I can just roll that up and eat it. So good. All right, so this concludes our historical cooking lunchtime learning video. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a lot of luck and really enjoy these recipes, make them at home. Next week, turn back in for Nate Salzman. He's going to be teaching a little bit about blacksmithing. If you want to turn and catch those right there, he's going to be teaching you how to make these S-hooks. And he's going to be showing you the basics of how to do it using clay. So if you have clay or Play-Doh, you can work along with him to kind of get the mechanics of how to do it.